Hello everybody, Ellie here for WhoCulture, and completely not related to Doctor Who, although I guess if we go down the route of David Tennant and Scrooge McDuck, maybe it is, but beyond that, how cool is my jumper? How cute is this? He's so cute. Is it new? No, it's been sat in my wardrobe for about 2 years since I went to Disney World. But have I worn it more than once? No. Don't ask me why, I have no idea. Anyway, I digress. That's not why we're here. What I actually want to talk to you about is a story that some of you might know, some of you might not know. And it's the tale of how David Tennant very nearly stuck around for one more series. Almost from the very beginning of Russell T Davies's time as showrunner, he kind of had a rough idea of when he planned to leave. The first time round in 2005 as opposed to now, and had this idea of some specials around the end of Series 4 and the beginning of Series 5, although he wasn't entirely certain quite how they would look at this point. But obviously one of the big questions when Russell was announced to be leaving, or when the decision was made that he was going to be stepping away, was who was going to take over the role of showrunner. But obviously, as we all know, it was Stephen Moffat who actually won the role of showrunner moving forward, probably off the back of his work such as The Empty Child and the Doctor Dances, Blink, Silence in the Library two-parter. I mean, he wrote some pretty good episodes, let's be honest. It was announced in May 2008 that he would be taking over the role of showrunner from Russell T Davies for Series 5 in 2010. But this was not the only thing going on behind the scenes at the time. So while the whole plan for Russell's departure and for these special episodes was being formulated, it was kind of just assumed that David Tennant would also be leaving with Russell T Davies. And David Tennant kind of indicated this himself towards the end of 2007, but then very quickly afterwards started to rethink his decision and very nearly changed his mind. First and foremost, he liked the direction that Stephen Moffat had planned to take Doctor Who in, but probably a bigger factor than that is that maybe he just wasn't sure if he was ready to go. See what I did there? I don't want to go. But what is interesting is when Moffat came to the time of his own departure, he kind of reflected on this, and this is what he said. David was just going through the now to me very familiar angst about leaving. Piers Wenger, who was one of the executive producers for the early Matt Smith years, and I went to talk to David, and I ran him through what that series would be if it was him. The thing is, as a long-standing fan of Doctor Who, you can see why David Tennant would struggle with this decision to leave. You mean, can you imagine if you had landed your dream job? Could you step away from it? Would you want to step away from it? But if he did remain, then he still would have only been staying for one more series, so the end would still have been coming close, even if he'd stayed for one more series. He was still going to be leaving. But then the question arises of what would Series 5 have looked like if it had been David Tennant in the role of the Doctor still, as opposed to Matt Smith? Well, Stephen Moffat did actually start to formulate a very basic idea of what this would look like, and I'm going to read it out here. It's quite a long quote, but it's full of detail, so just bear with. I only had the roughest idea. My pitch was that it would start with the TARDIS crashing in Amelia's back garden and a terribly battered and bruised 10th Doctor staggering out. Amelia finds him, feeds him fish custard. Actually, no, that was for Matt. It would have been something more David-y, and generally helps him. That's very interesting though. What would David Tennant's Doctor have been fed, as opposed to fish fingers and custard? In my mind, I'm kind of thinking, well, David Tennant is Scottish. Karen Gillan and Amy Pond is Scottish, Stephen Moffat is Scottish. Would it have been something like haggis? I don't know. Let me know in the comments. What do you think David Tennant's Doctor would have eaten in place of Matt Smith in that scene? But we, the audience, can see he's in a truly bad way. Dying, maybe. Eventually, he heads back to his TARDIS and flies off. But when he returns many years later for Amy, he seems perfectly fine and indeed doesn't remember any of those events. Over time, we realise what we saw was the 10th Doctor at the end of his life, about to regenerate, events that we return to in episode 13. So basically, the beginning would have been exactly the same as what we did eventually get in the 11th hour, with the Doctor crashing into Amelia's garden, kind of stumbling around her house, talking about the swimming pool, going into the kitchen, having the weird food situation going on, and then getting back in the TARDIS and flying away. But unlike the 11th hour, when he then returns and Amy is older, he doesn't remember anything about that previous encounter because the Doctor that Amy meets as a child is a future version of the Doctor. Dun dun dun! So then in the finale, we might even have seen the Doctor regenerate maybe in Amelia's back garden. Maybe she would have witnessed that regeneration. It's so interesting, really, if we ponder it. See what I did there? Ponder it. Oh, I make myself chuckle sometimes. But it basically is a combination of Series 5 and Series 6. The Series 5 and 6 that we actually got, that's basically what this idea is. If you think of Series 6, we open with a future version of the Doctor instigating the situation, and then we follow a younger version until we catch up with events. It's also very interesting that Stephen Moffat seemingly always planned for Amy Pond to be the companion, no matter which Doctor she was with. It's quite hard to imagine that, actually, because the character of Amy Pond is so intrinsically linked to the Doctor she meets as a child. And it's kind of interesting to imagine what Amy would have been like as a multi-Doctor companion, because she's so well linked with Matt Smith's incarnation, and that whole influence on her childhood is so important to the character. And this whole story could have been massively different. So David Tennant did meet with Stephen Moffat and discuss this pitch and this idea, and he really, really did like it, and he thought very, very hard about it. But eventually he did decide that he would be stepping away at the end of Series 4, or these Series 4 specials. It was announced that he announced at the National Television Awards that he would be stepping away from the role. Now, while this whole idea does sound really interesting, and I would love to see a kind of what-if version of this, personally, I think this was the right move to make. I think having Matt Smith arrive with Stephen Moffat, it felt like a kind of soft reboot of the show. I know we've discussed this before, as, you know, was Series 5 a reboot? It happens quite often, but I think it worked well, that it was kind of a clean break, and Tennant left with Russell T Davies, and we kind of moved into this soft reboot, this kind of new imagining of how Doctor Who would be. And the way that Series 5 did end up going, I do find it hard to kind of imagine how that would have worked with David Tennant in the role. You know, Matt Smith just makes that so fantastical and whimsical. But one of the shocking things is that Tennant's decision to leave Doctor Who very nearly meant that Doctor Who itself ended. So Moffat later revealed in a quote, which I'm going to read here, "I think there were plans maybe to consider ending it. The idea that Doctor Who could go on at all in the absence of David Tennant was a huge question." That's very, very baffling. A very baffling train of thought to have. Could you imagine? I mean, I think Matt Smith's first series in particular was so successful and so wonderful. But the fact that we may not have had that, and the idea that Doctor Who was so reliant on David Tennant to succeed. Now, I can see why, because David Tennant is fantastic in the role, and every time people ask me who my favourite Doctor is, I'm always like, yeah, it's predictable, it's the most common answer, but it is David Tennant. I mean, there's a reason he's so popular. But the idea that the show wouldn't work without him, I don't know. I mean, it's been proved wrong, because look how many wonderful Doctors we've had since, but I digress. Now, there's one other element of Series 5 and this whole idea of whether David Tennant remained that does need to be mentioned. Why? Because A, this is WhoCulture, B, this is me, and so C, the reason being River Song. Obviously, River was very involved from Series 5, Series 6 very centred around the character. What would it have looked like if we had David Tennant in Series 5 interacting with River? Would we have seen that? Now, I find it very interesting because, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm fairly certain that the creation of Amy Pond was completely linked to River Song, and the fact that Stephen Moffat always planned to have Amy in Series 5 kind of highlights to me that the River Song story was always the direction he was going to go in. And as we know, the character of Amy was created because she was then going to be the mother of this mysterious character who we'd met previously. But it would have been very interesting to see the Angel two-parter with David Tennant as the Doctor. I mean, the crash of the Byzantium is literally mentioned in the library.
Crash of the Byzantium, have we done that yet?
I do find it odd that whilst we did see River meet the Doctor for the first time in the library, she didn't look at him and go, "You've got a different face." And so it's very clear that although she didn't know much about this incarnation of the Doctor, she didn't seem confused by his appearance, so that suggests that there have been other meetings between this incarnation of the Doctor and River. And so while obviously there have been Big Finish audios that explore that relationship a bit more, it would have been really great to see more of these two versions of the characters interacting, to see David Tennant and Alex Kingston working alongside each other in this relationship. That is one of the things that I wish, if we could go back and change something, I wish we had seen one more episode after the library between David Tennant's incarnation and River Song. That's something I think is missing, and I'd love to see. In the meantime, I've been Ellie for WhoCulture, and seeing as we've just been talking about her, in the words of River Song herself, goodbye, sweeties.